Most of the nation were not for abolition at the time of the 13th Amendment, but blacks fighting for the Union made slavery and their subsequent right to vote inevitable.
While it is true that the majority of the American population were not initially in favor of abolishing slavery at the time of the Civil War, it is important to note that there were significant social and political movements calling for the end of slavery. The abolitionist movement had been active for several decades before the Civil War and had been instrumental in changing public opinion on the issue of slavery. Additionally, while the war itself was not initially fought to end slavery, the efforts of African American soldiers fighting for the Union, as well as the demands of black leaders and activists, helped to make the end of slavery and the enfranchisement of black Americans an inevitable outcome of the conflict. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, was passed in 1865, shortly after the end of the Civil War. So while it is true that the majority of the population were not initially in favor of abolition, it is also true that there were significant social and political movements advocating for it. And the actions of black soldiers and activists played a critical role in making the end of slavery and the eventual granting of suffrage to black Americans a reality.
Abolitionists were considered a fringe group in America regardless of the North or South. I think the highest any of them ever got was like 9% in votes.
It's true that abolitionists were initially a relatively small and politically unpopular group in the United States. However, the movement grew over time and played a significant role in building public awareness and support for the abolition of slavery. Abolitionists were known for their passionate and persistent advocacy for ending slavery, and their work helped to shift public opinion and build momentum for legislative action. The efforts of abolitionists ultimately helped to make slavery a central issue in American politics and led to the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude throughout the United States.
But abolitionists really didn't get what they wanted out of it, as 13th Amendment still allows slavery in the form of prison labor.
It is true that the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, makes an exception for the punishment of a crime. This has allowed for the use of prison labor in the United States, which has been criticized by some as a form of modern-day slavery. However, it is also worth noting that the 13th Amendment was a major victory for abolitionists at the time, and its passage was a significant step forward in the struggle for civil rights and equal treatment under the law. Many abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass, played important roles in the fight for the 13th Amendment, and their efforts paved the way for further progress in the years to come.
It was a moderate overall win. It didn't completely get rid of slavery, and it allowed Southerners to keep former slaves in prison.
Yes, the 13th Amendment did not completely get rid of slavery, as it contained a clause that allowed for slavery and involuntary servitude as punishment for a crime. This loophole was exploited by many Southern states, who used it as a way to continue to profit off of the labor of former slaves by arresting them for minor offenses and then forcing them to work in prison labor camps. However, the amendment did mark an important step forward in the fight against slavery, and it paved the way for further progress in the years that followed.
Conscription can also be considered a form of indentured servitude and slavery.
The use of conscription, or the drafting of individuals into military service, has been a controversial issue throughout history. While it is true that conscription can be seen as a form of involuntary servitude, it is not typically considered a form of slavery. The main difference between conscription and slavery is that conscription is a temporary requirement for military service, while slavery is a permanent and often lifelong condition of involuntary servitude. Additionally, individuals who are conscripted into military service are generally compensated for their work, while slaves are not. That being said, there have been instances where the use of conscription has been abused, and individuals have been forced to serve under harsh and inhumane conditions. In these cases, conscription can be seen as a violation of human rights and a form of slavery. It is important for governments to ensure that conscription is used fairly and equitably, and that the rights and well-being of individuals who are conscripted are protected.
The difference seems to be a slave owner, unless he is very wealthy, can't really afford to get his slave killed. The U.S. government can afford to get its soldiers killed because it can print money in order to replace the loss of the soldier.
That's an interesting point. It's true that the government has greater resources to replace the loss of soldiers in comparison to a slave owner who may not have the same resources. However, it's important to note that conscription is typically used as a last resort in times of war, when the government needs to quickly increase its military manpower and is not a permanent state of servitude like slavery or indentured servitude. Additionally, conscription is typically viewed as a civic duty or obligation, rather than a form of servitude, and individuals who are conscripted are typically compensated in some way, whether through pay, benefits, or other forms of support. Nevertheless, there have been debates about the ethics and morality of conscription, particularly in relation to individual freedom and autonomy.
Slaves are compensated, though, in food and housing from their masters.
While it's true that some slave owners provided food and housing for their slaves, this does not amount to compensation in the sense that we understand it today. Slaves were not paid for their labor and were not free to choose how they lived or worked. They were considered property, not employees, and had no legal rights or protections. They could be bought, sold, and abused at their owner's discretion. Even in cases where slave owners provided food and housing, it was often inadequate and of poor quality. Slavery is a fundamentally unjust system that denies human beings their dignity and basic rights.
The difference seems to be in social value. If you're conscripted against your will and you face numerous abuses and human rights violations, society will still pat you on the back and congratulate you for your service. Slaves don't get that.
Yes, you raise a valid point. There is definitely a difference in the way that society views and values conscripted soldiers versus slaves. While both may be compelled to work against their will, conscripted soldiers are often celebrated and honored for their service, while slaves have historically been dehumanized and exploited for the benefit of their owners. The issue of social value is complex and multifaceted, and it is influenced by a variety of factors, including cultural norms, historical context, and power dynamics.